She walked into the small supermarket, a respected police chief, unaware that her authority was about to be stripped away in the most humiliating way. A racist officer, fueled by prejudice rather than justice, accused her of theft without cause. In front of stunned customers, he ignored her badge, her years of service, and the truth itself. Handcuffs tightened around her wrists as her dignity was dragged through the aisles like common merchandise. But what he didn't know was that this moment would ignite a storm, one that would shake the entire police force to its core. The truth was coming, and justice would not be denied. Watch the full story unfold, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Sheriff Angela Carter stepped out of her unmarked cruiser, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the parking lot of Greenmart, a small supermarket on the city's south side. She had spent the morning dealing with a high-profile case and needed a brief moment to clear her head before heading back to the precinct. This wasn't her usual stop, but she had been here before, just another neighborhood grocery store, nothing out of the ordinary. Inside, the store bustled with activity. Families grabbed last-minute groceries, an elderly couple debated over cereal, and cashiers hurried through transactions. Angela moved through the aisles with practiced ease, selecting a bottle of water and a protein bar. Her uniform was immaculate, her badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. As she approached the register, she nodded politely at the cashier, who barely looked up as he rang up her items. Across the aisle, Officer Rick Stevens, known for his aggressive policing, observed her every move with calculated scrutiny. His posture was tense, his gaze unrelenting. He had always believed that authority belonged to men like him, and that belief dictated his actions. Angela felt the weight of his stare but dismissed it, knowing that men like him thrived on intimidation. She paid for her items and turned toward the exit, but before she could step outside, Stevens intercepted her path with an air of misplaced authority. The supermarket, alive with the hum of routine moments earlier, fell into an uneasy silence. Customers paused their transactions and conversations as Stevens raised his voice, demanding to see her identification. Angela, calm but firm, questioned his reasoning. Stevens, emboldened by the murmurs of an audience, accused her of handling merchandise suspiciously. Angela, unwavering, produced her receipt, but Stevens ignored it, his resolve unchanged. A second officer, Darren Cole, entered the store, standing beside Stevens. Unlike his partner, Cole exhibited hesitation, his expression uncertain. Years of following orders conditioned him to act without questioning, but something about the situation unsettled him. Tension crackled between them. Angela stood her ground, revealing her rank and identity. Recognition flashed across Cole's face, but Stevens was unfazed. He dismissed her credentials, escalating the confrontation. The murmurs in the store grew louder, some patrons raising their phones to record the exchange. Stevens seized her arm, twisting it behind her back before she could react. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she clenched her jaw, refusing to let it show. Cold metal tightened around her wrists as handcuffs clicked shut. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers, their disbelief palpable. The small supermarket had become the stage for an unjust humiliation. Customers protested, one stepping forward with his phone raised, asserting that Angela had done nothing wrong. Stevens silenced him with a warning glare, his grip on control tightening. Outside, a crowd gathered, drawn by the commotion. Angela, restrained and forced toward a waiting police vehicle, locked eyes with Cole. He looked away, guilt flickering behind his hesitation. Stevens, satisfied with his display of dominance, smirked as he shut the car door, convinced that her badge would offer her no protection now. As Angela sat in the back of the squad car, she remained eerily calm. She knew this wasn't just about her, it was about power and who got to wield it. She let out a slow breath, taking in the growing crowd, the flashing phones, the wide-eyed witnesses who had just seen a sheriff be taken down without cause. But then, something changed. A man in a dark hoodie stepped forward, raising his hands. He called out to the crowd, his voice carrying over the tense silence. He claimed to have seen everything, to have recorded it all, and he wasn't leaving until justice was served. Another woman joined him, lifting her phone. More voices rose in agreement, echoing the injustice they had just witnessed. The tension thickened as an off-duty journalist in the crowd began streaming the event live. The news was spreading faster than Stevens could control. Meanwhile, in the front seat, Cole's fingers tapped anxiously against his thigh. His instincts screamed that this situation was spinning out of control. He checked his radio, catching snippets of incoming calls. Dispatch was already aware of the incident, and senior officers were on their way. If he and Stevens didn't de-escalate soon, this was about to turn into a career-ending spectacle. Then, another problem arose. Angela, despite her restraints, sat forward, her voice calm but cutting. She issued a final warning, not as a desperate plea, but as a statement of fact. She knew her rights, and she knew how this would end. The law was on her side, and if Stevens thought he was untouchable, he was about to learn otherwise. Before Stevens could react, his radio crackled to life. A superior officer's voice came through, ordering them to halt and return to the station immediately. Stevens hesitated, his grip on control slipping. Angela could see the flicker of doubt behind his smug expression. He had overplayed his hand, and now he was trapped in his own reckless display of power. As the crowd pressed closer, the supermarket's manager stepped forward, his own surveillance footage in hand. The tension hit its peak. Angela wasn't just going to walk away from this, she was going to take Stevens down with her. This wasn't just a wrongful arrest. This was the beginning of a reckoning. Stevens sat in the patrol car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The weight of what had just happened began to settle in, but his pride refused to let him acknowledge it. His radio crackled again, another order from the station demanding an explanation. He ignored it for now, watching the crowd swell outside the supermarket. The tide was shifting, and he could feel it slipping out of his control. Cole sat stiffly beside him, his knee bouncing anxiously. He had followed orders, done what was expected of him, but the sight of Angela Carter in the back seat gnawed at him. He had respected her from a distance, her reputation, her leadership, her ability to command a room. And now she sat silent, her expression unreadable, but he knew she was calculating her next move. Angela knew how these things went. She had seen men like Stevens before, wielding authority like a hammer, mistaking fear for respect. He thought he had one, but he had made a mistake. He had underestimated who he was dealing with. She shifted slightly, testing the handcuffs digging into her wrists, refusing to show even the slightest discomfort. Her mind was already 3 steps ahead, working through every legal and strategic angle she could use to turn this around. Back at the precinct, Captain Reynolds paced behind his desk, rubbing his temple as he listened to the growing chaos over the radio. He had known Stevens was reckless, but this was a disaster. Angela Carter wasn't just some local nobody. She was connected, respected, and more importantly, she was smart. If this escalated, it wouldn't just take down Stevens, it would drag the entire department into scrutiny. He needed to contain this before it spiraled further. Outside the precinct, Terrell James, a journalist known for exposing police misconduct, refreshed his feed. The footage from the supermarket was spreading like wildfire. He had covered dozens of these incidents before, but this one was different. A sitting sheriff being arrested under flimsy pretenses was something the public wouldn't ignore. His sources inside the force had already begun whispering. The department was scrambling, and that meant there was a deeper story to uncover. As the patrol car pulled into the station's garage, Angela inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Stevens yanked the door open, gripping her arm tighter than necessary as he hauled her out. She didn't resist, didn't flinch. She wanted him to feel like he was in control for just a little longer, to let him dig his own grave deeper. Cole hesitated before following, the weight of his actions pressing against his chest. He had the sinking feeling that this was the moment his career would be defined by. Either he would continue down the path of blind loyalty, or he would start asking questions that men like Stevens didn't want asked. The moment Angela stepped into the precinct, the noise level dipped. Officers turned to watch, their reactions mixed. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others whispered among themselves. A few reached for their phones, knowing this was bigger than the usual arrest. Reynolds appeared in the hallway, his face set in stone. Stevens smirked, dragging Angela toward processing. He had every intention of making this as humiliating as possible. He wanted her fingerprinted, photographed, booked like a common criminal. But before he could move forward, Reynolds intercepted. His voice was low but firm, demanding an explanation. Angela held his gaze, waiting. She didn't need to say anything. Her mere presence, the knowledge of who she was enough to unsettle even the higher-ups. Stevens launched into his justification, spinning a tale of suspicion and misconduct. Reynolds listened, his expression unreadable, but inside, he was seething. Terrell arrived outside the station just as a new wave of protesters gathered. The story had reached the streets. People were demanding answers, demanding justice. It wasn't just about Angela Carter anymore. It was about every unjust arrest, every abuse of power, every act of racial profiling that had gone unanswered. He checked his messages again. One of his sources inside had sent a single text: "They're panicking. Something bigger is coming." Inside, Reynolds made a decision. He ordered Stevens to step back. This was too public, too reckless. Stevens, furious, clenched his jaw but complied barely. Angela exhaled, sensing the shift. The power Stevens had wielded so carelessly was starting to slip from his fingers. But this wasn't over. Angela knew men like him didn't let go easily. And when they lost control, they became dangerous. Reynolds stood in his office, tension pressing against his temples. The precinct was on edge, officers moving with uncertainty as news of Angela Carter's arrest spread through the ranks. He had thought that shutting it down quickly would contain the situation, but now it was spiraling into something much bigger. The media was already outside. Protesters were swelling in numbers. Inside, murmurs grew louder. Officers who once held blind loyalty were now beginning to doubt. Stevens paced in the holding area, his fists clenched. His face was still set in smug confidence, but inside, he felt the cracks forming. He had underestimated the backlash. He had assumed that arresting Angela would be another routine exercise of power, something he could bury under paperwork and protocol. But now, the walls were closing in. His radio buzzed with updates. Higher-ups wanted answers, and fast. Angela sat in the holding cell, her back straight, her mind razor-sharp. She had played this game before. She had seen it from the other side, how panic set in when the wrong person was targeted, how the machine scrambled to protect itself. Her presence here wasn't just an inconvenience to them, it was a crisis. They had locked up someone who knew the system too well, someone who wouldn't stay silent. And she had no intention of making this easy. Terrell, stationed outside, checked his messages again. His sources were feeding him updates by the minute. He had seen cover-ups before, but this was different. This was sloppier, more desperate. The department was split, with some officers pushing for Stevens to be reprimanded while others tried to close ranks. The fault lines were visible, and he knew where to press. Inside the precinct, Cole found himself at a crossroads. He had followed Stevens into this mess, but now he saw the damage. Angela Carter's reputation alone would have been enough to bring scrutiny, but this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every officer of color watching, every civilian who had been mistreated, every protester outside who had long since lost faith in the system. He had spent years convincing himself he was on the right side. Now, he wasn't so sure. Reynolds made the call. He summoned Stevens to his office, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. The conversation was sharp, filled with accusations and barely contained rage. Stevens defended himself, doubling down, refusing to acknowledge the storm he had created. But Reynolds saw the writing on the wall. He ordered Stevens to step down from the case, to let others handle the fallout. Stevens stormed out, but the damage had been done. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. Angela was pulled from her cell, escorted to an interrogation room. Not as a suspect, but as a problem they needed to solve. Reynolds sat across from her, his expression unreadable. He asked for her version of events, but he already knew what she would say. The truth wasn't what he wanted, it was a way out. Angela leaned forward, unshaken, and told him exactly what would happen next. The footage was already spreading, the protests would grow, and if they didn't handle this properly, they wouldn't just be dealing with public outrage, they would be dealing with legal consequences. Outside, Terrell prepared for the next step. The information he had wasn't just a news story anymore, it was evidence. And if the precinct wasn't going to fix this, the world would force them to. The pressure was building. The game had changed. And for the first time, Stevens wasn't the one holding the power. Stevens sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His career was slipping through his fingers, and he could feel it. His name was on every news report, his face circulating online as the officer responsible for what was quickly becoming the biggest scandal in the precinct's history. He had prided himself on control, on authority, but now he was the one losing both. Calls from his superiors had gone from frustration to outright demands: fix this, or he was done. Reynolds paced in his office, the phone pressed against his ear. The mayor's office was involved now, and that meant damage control was beyond the department's hands. He had tried to de-escalate, but it was too late. Angela Carter's arrest had set off something much larger than he had anticipated. Officers whispered in corners, unsure of what would happen next. Some sympathized with Stevens, others saw the writing on the wall. The divide was growing, and it threatened to tear the department apart. Angela sat in an interrogation room, her wrists finally free, but the fight was far from over. She had refused to be processed like a criminal, and now the precinct didn't know what to do with her. She was no ordinary suspect. They couldn't book her, couldn't release her without consequence. She was an exposed nerve in a system that thrived on silence, and she had no intention of being quiet. Her phone, confiscated, was still buzzing somewhere in an evidence bag. She knew what was happening outside. The protests were growing. The people weren't backing down. And neither was she. Terrell stood outside the precinct, his phone raised high as he live-streamed. The crowd had nearly doubled in size, their chants growing louder by the minute. More journalists had arrived, cameras flashing as they documented the unrest. He had been here before, covering similar stories, but this one was different. The department wasn't just fighting for its reputation, it was fighting for survival. Inside, they were scrambling, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they cracked. Cole sat in the locker room, his head in his hands. He had spent years believing he was on the right side of the law, but now he wasn't sure. He had followed Stevens without question, had assumed there was reason behind every order. But seeing Angela in cuffs, watching the fallout spiral beyond their control, had shaken him. He had always believed that the system worked. Now, he wasn't so sure. The precinct's legal team had arrived, a small army of suits moving through the halls. Their job was clear: mitigate the damage, find an angle, shift the blame. They were already drafting statements, carefully worded apologies that meant nothing. But Angela wasn't going to let them rewrite the narrative. The second they offered her a deal, she shot it down. She wasn't looking for a quiet resolution, she wanted the truth out. Reynolds knew they were out of time. If they didn't make a move soon, the department would collapse under the weight of its own mistakes. He ordered Angela to be released, but she refused to walk out the back door. If they were going to let her go, they would do it in front of every camera, in front of the crowd that had gathered demanding justice. She wasn't leaving in the shadows. She was stepping out into the light. Stevens watched from the side, his face unreadable. He could feel the power slipping from his hands, and it infuriated him. He had spent years building his authority, making sure people like Angela Carter knew their place. And now, she was walking free, while his career hung in the balance. He clenched his jaw, his mind racing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Stevens sat in the dimly lit bar, nursing a drink that did little to calm his nerves. His phone vibrated relentlessly on the table, messages from people he once considered allies, now distancing themselves. The department was cracking under the pressure, and he was at the center of it. He had thought he could control the narrative, but Angela Carter had flipped the script. He was no longer the one pulling the strings, he was the one being scrutinized. Reynolds was back at the precinct, locked in a meeting with city officials and legal advisors. The mayor wanted heads to roll, and it was clear someone had to take the fall. Stevens was an obvious choice, but there was resistance from certain factions within the department. They feared what might come to light if Stevens was forced out too soon. The conversation was tense, voices rising, fingers pointing. The department was running out of options, and the public wasn't letting this go. Angela sat in her apartment, scrolling through the flood of messages and calls that hadn't stopped since her release. Support poured in from all corners: activists, fellow officers who had remained silent until now, and legal teams offering their services. But there were threats, too. The kind that came from those who had everything to lose if she kept pushing forward. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. And yet, the weight of it all pressed against her, reminding her that the fight was far from over. Terrell was already working on the next exposé. He had spent the night compiling evidence, reaching out to sources willing to go on record. What had started as a story about one wrongful arrest was now unraveling into a broader indictment of the entire precinct. There were patterns, connections that pointed to a systemic issue. He knew that once he published, there would be no turning back. The truth was coming, and it would not be kind to those who had tried to bury it. Cole found himself in the middle of a growing divide. Officers who had once turned a blind eye to Stevens' behavior were now questioning everything. Some whispered in support of Angela, others still clung to the belief that Stevens had done nothing wrong. The tension in the precinct was palpable, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Cole had spent his career following orders, but for the first time, he wondered if loyalty had blinded him to the truth. Stevens knew he had to act. He couldn't just sit back and let his career be dismantled piece by piece. He reached out to an old contact, someone who knew how to make problems disappear. He needed leverage, something to shift the focus away from him. If he could find dirt on Angela, something that could discredit her, maybe he could turn the tide. The call was brief, the instructions clear. He would do whatever it took to survive. Angela received an anonymous tip later that night. A warning. Someone was digging into her past, looking for anything that could be used against her. She had always kept her record clean, but she knew how easy it was to twist facts, to fabricate stories when the right people were involved. This was expected. What mattered now was how she responded. Meanwhile, an anonymous figure delivered a flash drive to Terrell's apartment, tucked into an unmarked envelope. When he opened it, he found surveillance footage unedited, raw, and damning. It wasn't just about Angela's arrest anymore. It contained footage of multiple arrests over the past year, all orchestrated by Stevens. It showed officers planting evidence, fabricating charges, and brutalizing civilians under the guise of law enforcement. This was the smoking gun. If released, it wouldn't just take down Stevens. It would take down half the department. Terrell stared at the footage, his pulse pounding. He knew what this meant. He had expected a fight, but this was bigger than he had anticipated. He had to be smart. He made a call to Angela, his voice urgent. They needed to meet. Now. At the same time, Stevens was meeting with his contact, who handed him a manila folder containing manufactured evidence against Angela. Fake reports, doctored footage, anything that could be used to turn the narrative against her. He smirked as he flipped through the papers. This was his way out. He would go public with it, claim he had been set up, make Angela the villain. It was dirty, but it was survival. Cole, watching the precinct unravel, finally made his choice. He had seen too much, and he couldn't stay silent anymore. He found himself outside Reynolds' office, knocking twice before stepping inside. His voice was steady, but his heart raced. He had something to confess. Reynolds listened, his expression darkening. Cole laid it all out: the fabricated reports, the excessive force complaints buried under bureaucracy, the way Stevens had manipulated every situation to maintain control. The captain leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The department was a sinking ship, and the only way out was to throw someone overboard. As dawn broke, the city was bracing for the inevitable explosion. Terrell, Angela, and their growing network of allies had the truth in their hands. Stevens, desperate and cornered, was about to play his last card. And Reynolds, seeing the full picture for the first time, realized that no matter how this ended, the department would never be the same again. Stevens sat in his car, gripping the manila folder containing the manufactured evidence against Angela. He had spent years mastering control, manipulating narratives, twisting facts to suit his needs. This was supposed to be no different. Yet, something gnawed at him this time. He was playing defense. He was backed into a corner, and it infuriated him. His contact had assured him this was enough to bury Angela, but as he thumbed through the pages again, he knew this wouldn't hold up under real scrutiny. He needed more. He needed something undeniable. Reynolds stood in his office, his fingers drumming against the desk. Cole's confession had changed everything. He had suspected corruption in the department for years, but had never been willing to confront it. Now, the evidence was irrefutable. The mayor was demanding immediate action. He was caught between loyalty to his officers and the survival of the department. If he didn't act now, this would consume them all. He exhaled sharply, dialing an internal number. Stevens was about to find out just how alone he really was. Angela met Terrell in a secure location, the flash drive between them like a ticking bomb. The footage it contained would destroy not just Stevens, but the entire infrastructure that had enabled him. They both knew what was at stake. If they released it recklessly, it could be buried, discredited before the public even had a chance to process it. They needed a plan. Angela's jaw tightened as she considered their next move. This wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. This was about justice. And justice needed precision. At the precinct, officers whispered in hushed tones. The rift between those who supported Stevens and those who had seen enough was widening. The station, once a well-oiled machine, was fracturing. A few younger officers had started speaking up, questioning the practices they had once accepted without thought. Some had even begun quietly passing information to Terrell's network. The walls of silence were cracking, and the truth was seeping through. Stevens made his next move. He called in a favor with an old contact in the media, someone who had covered for him before. He needed them to break the story first on his terms. If he could frame Angela as the instigator, as someone who had manipulated public perception for her own gain, he might still have a chance. The deal was set, and within hours, the first headlines began to shift. Stories painting Angela as a radical, as someone with a history of bending the law, started circulating. It was a desperate move, but desperation made men dangerous. Angela saw the headlines, her stomach twisting with frustration. She had anticipated this, but seeing it play out was another thing entirely. She had spent her life upholding the law, and now the same system she had protected was trying to break her. But she wasn't alone. As she scrolled through the online discourse, she saw the pushback. People weren't buying the spin. The footage Terrell had been leaking piece by piece was gaining traction. The truth had its own momentum now. Reynolds received another call this time from the district attorney's office. The mayor had made his decision. Stevens was to be suspended, pending an official inquiry. The moment he hung up, he summoned Stevens to his office. The conversation was brief, laced with thinly veiled threats and unspoken understandings. Stevens was out. But he wasn't going quietly. As he stormed out of the precinct, his mind raced. He had one last card to play, and he was going to use it. If he was going down, he was taking Angela with him. He reached for his phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. If he couldn't win this through official channels, he would find another way. Angela prepared for what was coming next. She had won this round, but the battle was far from over. She knew Stevens. She knew men like him didn't just accept defeat. But she wasn't afraid. She had fought her way to this moment, and she would see it through to the end. Stevens sat in his car, staring at his phone. The last call had changed everything. He had expected to be left hanging, abandoned by those who once backed him, but the voice on the other end had given him one last out. He had leverage, a final move that could burn the entire precinct to the ground. If they wanted to throw him to the wolves, he'd make sure he didn't go down alone. Reynolds stood in the conference room, watching as senior officials debated the next course of action. The department was in shambles, the media relentless, the public outcry uncontainable. The mayor's office had ordered a full review, and heads were already rolling. But it wasn't enough. There were talks of federal intervention, of external investigations that would uncover more than just this one incident. The problem wasn't just Stevens, it was systemic, and now it was too big to hide. Angela sat across from Terrell, her mind racing. The leaks had worked, but they had also escalated everything. Stevens was cornered, and that made him unpredictable. She knew his type. He wouldn't just fade away. He would lash out, try to drag as many people down with him as possible. She checked her phone again, messages flooding in from supporters and threats from those who saw her as the enemy. Every move from this point on had to be calculated. One mistake and everything could collapse. Cole found himself in an unfamiliar position. He had spent his career avoiding conflicts like this, following orders without question. But now, he was in the center of it. Officers whispered in hallways, some waiting for Stevens to make his next move, others preparing for the fallout. Cole had already made his choice. He had sided with Angela, with the truth. There was no going back. Now, he had to make sure he survived what was coming next. Stevens walked into the precinct with his head held high, despite knowing that every set of eyes was on him. He had been told to clean out his desk, but he had other plans. He went straight to the locker room, opening a compartment he had secured for years. Inside was a collection of files, records, reports, names. The kind of information that could bury careers. If they thought they could erase him, they were wrong. He tucked the files into his bag and walked back out, making sure Reynolds saw him. A silent message. He wasn't finished yet. Angela received a tip. Stevens was planning something big. He had dirt, and he was going to use it. She knew she had to act first. She and Terrell sat down to strategize, pulling every contact they had. The press was on their side, the public demanded justice, but they needed a final blow, something that would seal Stevens' fate permanently. They had to expose everything before he had the chance to spin it his way. Reynolds called a last-minute meeting, bringing in internal affairs. Stevens had to be dealt with before he could make his move. The walls were closing in, and there was only one way to control the situation: arrest him before he had the chance to retaliate. Officers were sent to bring him in, but Stevens was already ahead of them. By the time they reached his house, he was gone. Angela and Terrell released the final piece of evidence, the full, unedited footage from inside the precinct. It showed Stevens coercing officers, planting evidence, manipulating reports. It wasn't just him, it was an entire network of corruption, a system built to protect itself at all costs. Within hours, the department was in full crisis mode. Officers resigned, the chief of police was forced to step down, and federal investigators arrived to take control. Stevens was found 2 states away, hiding in a motel. When they arrested him, he was still clutching the files, as if they could still save him. But it was too late. His power was gone, his allies had abandoned him, and now he was just another disgraced officer caught in his own web of lies. Angela stood outside the courthouse as the news broke. The battle was over, but the fight wasn't finished. The system was still flawed, still dangerous, but this was a start. She had survived, she had fought back, and now she was ready for whatever came next.